really do think like if this is after everything you put into it, sort of how he shows up at the end of the day, it's some real confirmation that like it's time to put a clean break and really set that boundary. And I really truly think that one day you'll look back and be like, wow, that was really hard, but that was definitely for the best, because you deserve someone who's willing to like show up and do the work and have the tough conversations and be consistent and like be there with their actions and do all these things that you need at the end of the day and are deserving of, and that make a healthy relationship. And someone who says, I just can't address my fears, they're too deep, I can't look at them, unfortunately that person isn't fully capable of a truly healthy relationship, right? It's like they can only give you a partially healthy relationship. And after all the work I think everybody does in here, I think it's like an injustice to ever stay in a position like that. And so, you want somebody who's going to put in as much as you're putting in, and it's really important to set that boundary. So, good for you for everything you've done. And I know it'll be a weird new chapter, but do the How to Heal from a Breakup course. It's going to help you like sort of process some of that stuff and take that time for yourself and like really pour everything that he was giving. I know he was giving you a lot of that like protection and those sorts of feelings, supportiveness. And it's like, great, take that on yourself, have more healthy friendships and other people in your life who can give that to you. And honestly, you're going to have a much better relationship one day instead. So thank you so much for sharing that. And really great question. Okay. And hello to all these beautiful faces in here. Some new faces, some familiar faces as well. Hi. Okay. So we're going to dive into this. So we're going to talk about today a lot to do with how to repair a relationship when it's on the rocks. One of the prerequisites I'll say, and really on topic with Natalie's question, is we can repair any relationship as long as the other person's willing to do the work. But that's really, and I've said this many, many times, and I know for some of you, this will be a broken record, but like the number one thing I would look for in my practice when people would come in was not, what's your attachment style or how much trauma do you have? Or none of that was really that relevant. It was, are both parties willing to show up and really willing to like look at their stuff and take accountability and take ownership and have the hard conversations and like bring things to the surface and to sit down and say like, we're going to sit here until we find resolution. Like that's the intention. We're coming from that perspective. And, there were times really truly where things take a while, like where I would know, for example, that there was this like 20-year resentment held on to by two clients. And I'd be like, okay, let's book a 3-hour session. And I would literally book out like a 3-hour session and we're going to dig everything up and we're going to, move through everything and do all that work. And, and people would, if they were like, our butts are not leaving the couch until we've moved through this. So, that dedication and commitment is really, really key. And sort of, again, like on Natalie's question, like if we're going to show up and do all this, we are creating like the best life for ourselves through doing this heavy lifting and the hard work. It's how we have like proper, open, healthy, committed, thriving relationships where like, we're not holding on to resentment. We're not like, getting our needs met in these sort of roundabout ways because we can't go to the person that we love directly. Like we don't have to fall into that trap, but because we're going to show up that way, we really have to make sure that we hold a boundary for ourselves that says, I need somebody else to at least follow me, at least to like be on the same page with like how much they're willing to give and pour into the relationship, and that they're willing to do the tough stuff. Sometimes they don't have to know all the tools and be sitting doing all the courses and like have the same degree of emotional literacy. But if I'm guiding a conversation saying, hey, I don't want to move until we have resolution. So like, let's talk about our feelings. Let's talk about our needs. Let's get vulnerable here. I know it's hard. I know we have resistance towards each other right now, but like, we don't want to stay like this. So let's do it. Let's do the work. Unless we have someone willing to participate, then it becomes an injustice of a relationship again. So just, before we dive into all of this, I'm going to give you guys all these tools and we're going to talk about all these things, but please know like that's a really important prerequisite, because then we get into easily relationships that we're pouring in. And then, there's a lack of fairness in that. Right. And that's only at long-term going to create more resentment and more forms of self-abandonment going forward. So, okay. So a few things we're going to touch on today. Number one, we're going to talk about some of the top reasons relationships fail. And we're just going to go through like sort of a high level there. Just things to be aware of, things to know. And what I would advise doing when we talk about this is just listen to these different reasons. There's 8 major ones and just try to see like, what patterns are yours the most, right? So when you're doing this, be like, oh yeah, I really struggle with number two. That's my place of work, right? It's always going to show you where you have some healing or things you can do to help yourself feel even better in your life and relationships. Then the next thing we're going to talk about is just like working through, and these are going to be all these major parts of like how to actually heal and transform our relationship dynamics. We're going to talk about the importance of clarity, communication, and expectations, and really learning about these things and becoming conscious about them. We're going to talk about identifying our primary and secondary trigger patterns, okay, and like how to actually resolve these things. A lot of this content comes from the How to Repair Any Relationship, and we have so many requests for this content on an ongoing basis. So I put it in a webinar, but then a lot of it's bonus content too. So you'll hear some familiar themes and you'll hear a bunch of new stuff. Then we're going to talk about how to resolve these trigger patterns. And then we're going to talk about communication and de-escalation. Sometimes it's one thing for us to become masterful at learning to de-escalate ourselves in a conversation. And we bring things to a bit of a next level when we learn to help someone else de-escalate in a relationship. And again, as we're learning all these things, we have to be so mindful that like we don't start getting into the role of like therapists in our relationship. We can use these things as tools, but then we have to make sure that we're not thinking, oh, and I'm responsible for somebody. Like we can use a tool and somebody's going to respond or they're not. That's not on us. We can initiate things, but we can't, change or control how people are going to react or respond to us. And then we're going to talk about some really important key ingredients that whenever we're in the power struggle stage of our relationship, because so many relationships fail or struggle in this stage, obviously, we're going to talk about key ingredients that we want to like season into this stage, because we're all going to go through the power struggle phase of a relationship at some point or another. And it can be really challenging and really tricky, but ultimately these things are literally here for us, right? They're here to support us. And so when we can get really clear about these things and we can like show up, have the right ingredients to season ahead of time, this is going to make our relationship dynamics a lot easier. And then we're going to talk about important rebonding components of relationships. So after we've gone through a challenging month, after we've gone through a challenging 6 months, because maybe the power struggle stage lasted that long. For those of you who have any questions about this stuff, like people can be in the power struggle stage for the majority of their relationship. They can go dating, honeymoon, power struggle for 20 years and just stay stuck there. But we're going to talk about how to like really not just move out of that and learn to evolve beyond that, but also how to stay in a situation where we can reconnect at a deeper level after that. Okay. So first and foremost, so this is where you want to take sort of inventory and decide, okay, where am I struggling with this out of all these 8 major features? So the top reasons relationships fail. Number 1, we went in without clarity of direction. Okay. And this is like starting almost chronologically from how things work. If we go into, and this is not just going to apply to the relationship area of your life, this applies to everything. If we go into relationship dynamics where we are struggling, we don't have clarity, we don't know what we want, we don't know what our standards or non-negotiables are in relationships, then we're just more likely to end up with somebody who we may not actually be that compatible with long-term, who may want really different things. And we have to hold those boundaries and standards for ourselves if we want what we're truly looking for in relationships. So let's like put this in a different context. It's like very simple to break down. Let's say you want to work as a project manager at a corporation as your career. Okay. And let's say this is something you really want. It's something you went to school for. It's something you're passionate about. You love this stuff. You read about this stuff. You like look at this stuff all the time. Then let's say you start going and applying for job offers. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I don't have that position open, but I have a position as a manager open, but you have to stay in this position for 5 years, or you have to stay really committed to this position. Like it's a manager. Going to be like, okay, like a general manager sort of position versus the project man. Well, for those of you who don't know, project managers are very like technical positions in a lot of different ways. And they involve like a certain way of managing people. Probably wasn't the best example, but it's a certain way of like showing up. You can take things and you can try to move to a different position like within a company. But if you know that company, for example, doesn't have any project manager positions or doesn't have like a technical side of the company, let's say you're like an office manager instead, like you're going to be a little bit unhappy. Like if you are going into something and it's not what you're actually wanting, not what you're actually passionate about, you're going to feel limited at different points in time. And, you could argue, you have to pay your bills, you have to do all these different things. But at the end of the day, like if you're committing to the wrong things over and over again, and you're always like not allowing yourself to really follow through with what you actually want and really go after and like hold out for the things that are meaningful and important to you, we spend a lot of time at our workplace. And we spend even more time usually thinking about, invested in, spending time with our romantic partners and relationships. And so, we have to make sure that we're not in a position where we're consistently committing to things that are not actually what we're looking for. And I've had a lot of conversations with people over the years who said things to me like, I really wanted kids. And, the person I met really didn't want kids. And I just thought it would change. I just thought things would be different. And they weren't, and things didn't change. And, now I'm 10 years into this relationship, realizing that I have to leave or that I'm unhappy. And these are like these kind of tragic moments where we like abandon what we truly want to try to be in a position where we are okay with how this person's showing up or what they're able to bring to the table. And this is a huge reason relationships fail, or things that we just have as complete non-negotiables, or things we really want in relationships that we don't make room for. Somebody being disrespectful all the time, verbally rude and harsh and verbally abusive at times, where we're like, oh, it's okay, they're just hurt, that it'll get better. Usually things get worse. They usually don't get better. They usually get harder with time, unless we're actually going in and doing the work. So it's extremely important we have clarity of like what we're actually looking for ahead of time, and we hold out for those things. We hold out for somebody who's willing to participate in the tough conversations and do the actual heavy lifting in relationships. So really, really important. Another big reason relationships fail is we're lacking clarity in who we are as people. I've seen a lot of people over the years be like, I want this in relationships. I want someone who looks this way, talks this way, has this kind of job, shows up this way in a relationship, has all these characteristics. And then when it's like, okay, and how are you showing up in relationships? Are you showing up like that? Are you willing to do all the things that you're looking for from someone else? Are you in a similar position in life? And sometimes someone will be like, actually, no, not at all. And so it's like, sometimes we want things, but we're not willing to show up from our perspective, to be the things and to embody the things that we think we're worthy and deserving of, right? It can really go either way. Number 3, we're unable to resolve conflicts. This is like probably the biggest reason relationships fail, period. Because we either don't have the tools to communicate, or we are afraid to address conflicts. We're always sweeping things under the rug, or we're unable to resolve our subconscious pain points that are related to relationships. So we're always bringing past wounds into the present experience of our relationships. Number 4, we don't articulate our boundaries, our feelings, our needs. And this is a one-way ticket or trip to resentment and frustration, and to feeling unseen, unheard, and unimportant. If I don't know what my needs are, I don't talk about my needs, I am not going to feel like my needs are met in my relationships. If I don't know how to express my feelings when something doesn't feel good for me and honor that and say, hey, I need you to understand this or see this, then I'm always going to feel like someone's stomping on my feelings, ignoring my feelings, not making space for my feelings. And same thing with my boundaries. And all of these things ultimately are a reflection of, are we showing up for these things in the relationship to ourselves first? As we do, and as we empower these things, then we get into a position where we can see very clearly if somebody's willing to be what we need in a relationship or not, right? If somebody's still violating our boundaries, still not making space for our needs, then we're in the wrong relationship. But if somebody's willing to consider these things in a healthy way, and as long as there's this healthy exchange of energy happening that way, then you can bet that like, good, we're on the right track here. Next one, we do not work on our old stories and core wounds, and we bring them into the relationship through a space of emotional volatility. Number 6, we have unrealistic expectations in relationships. This is a really big one. We expect other people to fill the voids from usually our childhood for us. So, for example, if I felt as a child, something where I feel like somebody's not respecting my freedom. As an adult, I'm like, my partner better respect all of my freedom all the time. Or, we have these voids. Some other really good ones are like when we feel unseen in childhood, we often get into a position where we're like, oh, this person really needs to see me and do that work for me and make me feel special. Or if we feel unsafe in childhood, oh, my partner better be the person who makes me feel safe all the time. We have to address these things within the relationship to ourselves first. And then we can have them in our subconscious mind is primed for these things secondarily. And then a huge reason that people get stuck in failing relationships is because they choose to stay in things out of fear of being alone instead of choosing from a place of what their truth is. Okay. So it's like, oh, if I have an abandonment wound, I would rather stay in something because I'm afraid of the pain of being alone. If the pain of being alone is a 9 out of 10, when that abandonment wound is triggered, and the pain of being in a relationship where someone's not showing up in the way that I need is a 6 out of 10. Oh, I'm going to pick the 6 out of 10 over the 9 out of 10. Sometimes we have to get brave and face the pain. Sometimes we have to become courageous and be like, this is going to hurt, this abandonment wound, but I'm going to do the work to work through it. So I'm not dishonoring and disempowering myself long-term. And it can be a scary thing to do, but it's a really powerful thing to do. And you will always thank yourself long-term from making decisions from that perspective. And it's very important that we honor that. Jungle Kitty, I like your costume too. All these costumes today, it's amazing. The next and last one, and you really want to, check in here and see which one resonates with you or which multiple ones resonate with you. And then we're going to break them down and go into a whole bunch of detail. If one or both partners are unwilling to compromise, empathize, put in the work, and see the other person's point of view. So I would actually say, I know I said we're unable to resolve conflicts, but this is probably the highest one, is if we just don't have the other person willing to participate, no matter how much we show up and we do the work, the person's going to give what they're going to give. And we have to be able to take the time to honor within ourselves, is this fair to me or not? So we're going to go through first and foremost a little bit about clarity. Okay. So whenever we're trying to repair a relationship and we know, okay, I'm in this place of like reparation, I'm trying to make it work. We talk about this all the time, so I won't even go through it at like a super deep level, but I have to put this into any repairing relationship course. We always have to start with a deadline. We cannot stay in things. And I'm telling you guys, like, you'd be shocked some of the things, but like sometimes people will stay in, I'm going to make it work, we'll fix it eventually mode for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And they're just in a space of self-abandonment. So whenever we're going to repair a relationship, we have to make sure that we have a closed loop on it. We have to be able to say, I'm going to do everything I can and work really hard up until X point, right? So and we always want to make that reparation stage relative to the investment we already have. So for example, if you're in a relationship where you're married, you have a mortgage, you have children, you have all these commitments, you may say, I'm going to work really hard for 2 years, for 3 years. If you're in a 6-month relationship and it's been really difficult, you might go, okay, I'm going to work at this for 1 more month, right? So relative to where you're at, this is going to be the time period, and you have to set that internal deadline, because if we don't, we stay in the gray area forever. And there's nothing worse than being in the gray area with all that uncertainty, then all the pain in the relationship, all of those challenges. Then we want to define how much the needle has to move for us to feel like it's worth extending that deadline, continuing past. And in order to do this, you have to define your desired outcome. So for example, if you're in a relationship where like there's no communication and you feel like we're not working through any problems, and let's say you've been in the relationship for 2 years, you might be like, okay, we're having a really hard time working through things and I can feel all the resentment building and we've really been on the rocks for the past 3 or 4 months. I'm going to put the next 3 or 4 months into really working at this. And, by the end of that 3 or 4 month segment, if things don't change, then I may have to choose to move away from the relationship. And what I'm looking for as change, like what does change mean? I'm looking for us to like have more vulnerability. We don't have to be perfect, but I'm looking for us to be able to talk about our feelings, discuss our needs, empathize with where each other are coming from, and actually show up to meet some of those needs after a conflict or a pain point that's happened. And so you have to get clear about like, what's the needle moving or not, right? And you want to look at things like what patterns we're not working, like if you're trying to find what your desired outcome is, you can ask yourself these questions, like what patterns were not working and what do you both need to change in order to resolve these patterns? Okay, so get really clear and specific, and that's going to help you decide, are we making change or not? You may decide, we both need more vulnerability. You may decide, I need to self-soothe more and this person needs to be more vulnerable. So you're going to go through and really define those things. And then you want to define a little bit about like, what's the expected amount of effort on both sides? One of the really important things when we're setting a deadline is we're not here to expect perfection, and we have to make that known. Okay, so when you set a deadline and then you communicate to somebody, you don't have to say, I've set a deadline, you're on the clock, but you may say, look, we're going through a tough period. I think staying like this in the relationship and the way that we're operating right now is not sustainable long term. I think we really need to put in the work because we're not on a good path right now. Here's what I'm going to work on. Here's what I would love for you to work on. I want your feedback as well. And, I'd like us both to invest X amount of effort on a regular basis, right? So you may say, let's sit down and have like a weekly check-in with each other. Let's have like these habits we put into our relationship. And you really want to like communicate and be clear about what these things are. And then you want to create strategies to make this happen, right? So when you sit down, you want to be able to brainstorm, these are the different strategies. These are the different things that I think would be a really good idea to work on. And internally, you want to be in a place where you're able to say, this is what I want the clear outcome to be for me. This is how I want to feel at the end of the day when that deadline is reached. And if you see the needle moving and you can see, okay, we're coming from a good place, make sure you say to the person when you're talking about how we need to change, we're not going to be perfect at this. Because we're having this conversation doesn't mean that we're going to wake up tomorrow morning and like all of our problems are going to be resolved, or that every time we try to resolve a problem and have a tough conversation, that it's going to go really well. Sometimes we're going to try really hard and it's going to be a disaster for a little bit and we're going to just have to pick up the pieces and try again. But the goal here is for us to not expect to be perfect and to just keep trying and keep showing up to do the work. So this is really, really important in terms of like how we choose to show up here. Okay. Now, when it comes to clarity, like within ourselves, like who we are and what we want, it's really important in relationships that you start by defining your preferences. So these are things like the desires you naturally lean towards. You may have things here that say, if you're trying to be conscious and intentional, right? So let's say you're out of a relationship doing this work, or let's say you're in a relationship and you want to bring more of the things that matter to you into the relationship dynamic. Okay. So we'll give an example for both. Let's say, for example, a preference would be something like, oh, I prefer someone who likes the outdoors, who has blonde hair, who has, X, Y, Z. So these are things that you just naturally move towards. This can be very beneficial to define these things if you're currently single and know you're going to be back in a relationship at some point. Or this can be very beneficial if you're in a relationship and you're like, oh, I really like people who like the outdoors and my partner's not really doing that. Let me talk about that. Let me ask if we can go do more outdoor activities. Let me bring that up in a healthy way, right? So either way, it's allowing you to get your needs met and your preferences met in relationships. You can think of preferences as being things that are not extremely high priority, but would be really nice and would improve the quality of your relationship. Then we have our standards in relationships. And these are the things that are very important to you in relationships. Okay. And this can be because it has a major impact on your lifestyle. These can be things like, let's say you have a really high need for freedom. And maybe you love to travel and that like, if you're going to have a family, it's going to be important to you that the other person wants to travel with the family. You may say, a standard I have is that this person is open to doing things like that because that's how I see my life being lived, right? That's like what I want for my future. That's what I want my dynamic to look like. And another example that I'll hear from people a lot is things like, oh, if I want somebody who's also very ambitious because I'm very ambitious. I like to grow and work and expand things. And, I want somebody to at least be like on a similar wavelength or page. So these are things that like, are really important to you. They're not non-negotiables. They won't make you like make or break a situation, but if there's multiple of them, you may decide that the person's not really compatible with you. Now, the differentiator here between this and a non-negotiable is that a standard is usually a solvable problem through a little bit of acceptance or a lot of communication. So for example, let's say it's the traveling example, and you're someone who really loves freedom and really wants to travel around, and you see your life being lived like that. If somebody says, no, I'm like a homebody, I like to stay home, I don't want to do any of that, I don't see that, you may say, okay, look, this is really important to me, that's really important to you, how can we come to a place where we make a healthy compromise somewhere in the middle? And that, for example, could be that you open up and you make a commitment. Look, we'll travel, instead of the ideal of traveling once a month, we're going to try to travel once or twice a year. And then on your side of that, you have to get really clear if that's okay with you. You have to truly take yourself into consideration and show up to like evaluate the relationship to yourself and see, does this work for me or not? Okay. And then we have non-negotiables. Non-negotiables are the things we absolutely will not budge on. And if you do, and you do violate your own non-negotiable, there's actually usually a really big downside in the relationship to yourself. It's a form of self-betrayal, a form of self-abandonment. It goes against your morals, your values, things like that. So this can be things like at a very high level that are clear and easy. Things like one person wants children, the other person doesn't. It can be that people from a certain religious background, a way of showing up in relationships, that one person thinks it's okay to call someone else rude names all the time because their parents did that and it's fine. And another person's like, no, that's like not going to happen in the relationship. And so if we budge on that, you know, you can imagine what all those things look like long-term, right? It's like, oh, there you are 10 years later with someone calling you names all the time. It was never okay with you. It's still not okay with you. The other person thinks it's not that big of a deal. Huge detriment to the relationship, to yourself. You hurt you in that situation. So of course that person hurts you too, but there's like that really strong internal component. And for other people, these can be things like, I've heard a lot of things over the years, like hunting, you know, somebody who hunts, somebody who's vegan or not vegan, you know, you hear a lot of these things where it's like those really important internal things to people. Another one that I've seen that's a common one is smoking. And for some people, smoking is like not a big deal. But I've had conversations with people where it's like, oh, well, my very close family member passed away from lung cancer, and so I don't want any smoke in my house. And then, you know, so again, these things are not non-negotiables on their own. They're non-negotiables based on the relationship that the person has to them. Okay. So we have to get really clear about these different things going into relationships. And if you're in a relationship now, I would urge you to like check in and ask yourself, are these things violating any of my non-negotiables? Are there multiple standards that are really important to me that are not being taken into consideration in the relationship? And if so, how can I bring these conversations into a relationship? How can I start communicating about these things so they're on the table? Because if we don't, we hurt over time. Okay. We dishonored our needs. We dishonored things that are important to us. So those are really important things to start off with. And then another question you can ask yourself is, all the things that I'm wanting from a relationship, am I showing up in a similar manner? Okay. So if I'm hoping that somebody's going to be kind, respectful, willing to do the work, show up, consistent, good at communicating. If I have all these things that I need under my standards, am I doing those things? And it's really important to evaluate ourselves also in that umbrella, because sometimes we go one way or the other. You know, I find that either people are like putting all this expectation on others, but then not sometimes doing the work on themselves, or doing so much work on themselves, showing up so much with themselves, and then like not allowing them to hold standards for other people and thinking like, oh, it's okay. And sometimes that comes from a bit of a place of unworthiness, right? And so we have to be able to recognize we're also worthy and deserving of this on the recipient end. Okay. And we want to look at things from both sides there. So really important stuff to start off with. Now, those are like our prerequisite pieces. Okay. What do we do when we're in a tough situation? We actually have to start beginning to target and work through old problems. Well, number one, we have to recognize that everyone has primary and secondary trigger patterns in relationships. And if we can't resolve these, we're actually not going to really move out of the power struggle stage of relationships in general. And when we're resolving primary and secondary triggering patterns, and what this means, you're going to learn about in a second, we have to be able to resolve them both intrinsically, because some of it's our own, and in the relationship dynamic. And this goes with all major problems. A lot of people will say to me like, oh, but people should all be responsible for their own feelings. Or some people will be like, no, 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 everything has to be resolved in the relationship. It's not one or the other, it's both. That's what interdependency is. So like, let's say, for example, that I'll give a first example of a primary triggering pattern. This was the first time I like realized that this stuff was like a thing. And it was, I was working with this couple, and they, the male in the relationship had a big fear of abandonment, and kind of like an assumed abandonment. Like it was like he was FA leaning DA, and just assumed everyone was going to leave, but was like pretty aware of it. And then the female in the relationship had a big wound around feeling like unseen, unheard, unimportant. Like those things really hurt her. And it was really important for her to like communicate about stuff. So she said, you know, they were sort of in the power struggle stage. Like it was, you know, a year and a half, going up to 2 years in the relationship. And she said, you know, they were in beginning the power struggle stage, and they were starting to have more arguments and more problems popping up. And she said she would try to go to him and talk about this stuff and say, hey, like I have this problem, I have this pain point. And he would turn around to her and be like, you're just leaving. I know you're going to leave anyways. It's fine. Just leave. And she'd be like, no, that's not why I'm coming to talk about this. I'm coming to talk about this because I want us to work through stuff. Like, and she couldn't understand like why. And so she would, right. So she would try to approach something. It would trigger his big, big, big core wound of I'm abandoned. I'm going to be abandoned anyways. And then as soon as she would try to approach it, his abandonment wound would then trigger her biggest core wounds, that I'm unseen, I'm unheard, I don't matter, because she felt like he doesn't care enough to even want to talk about stuff. Like, why doesn't he want to work through stuff? And so what this does is it puts us in these really compromising positions in relationships, because now all of a sudden here we are and we're like, we really want to work through something or talk through something, but it just so happens. And by the way, every relationship that's very intimate and close has this. It just so happens, I haven't seen any exception to this, that one person's biggest core wound triggers the other person's biggest core wound. And there's usually two of them. There's like a really big one, and then there's usually like a secondary one that's also there. So we have to identify in our close relationships. And by the way, as well, this isn't just romantic relationships. This is your family relationships. This is your sibling relationships. Your really, really close friendships can have these as well. So we have to be able to learn to identify what these wounds and patterns are and get really good at them. So in turn, we can actually have the opportunity to move through this stuff. Okay. So what you want to look for is like, what are these major dynamics and where are they coming from? Like, and when we look at like the idea of interdependency, this woman, for example, could work do all the work on her core wounds of feeling like I am seen, I'm heard, I matter, and do that work in the relationship to herself to make her feelings and needs seen, heard, and matter. But if we're looking for a relationship that's interdependent, then that still has to be a discussion in the relationship, right? There's that component as well. And so if we only work on it ourselves, then we're probably not going to heal the relationship. And if we don't learn to communicate about these things in a relationship, then people are probably going to hit our wounds all the time in different ways without recognizing, because we're not conscious of them and we're not talking about them. So how could somebody else even realize or not realize that that's happening? So when we're trying to resolve things, we have to talk about them together in the collective of the relationship itself. So what essentially happens is we've got this reprojection of old wounds and unmet needs. And I really want us to get clear about this. And we've mentioned this sort of a couple times in different places, but the greatest unmet needs we have in the relationship to ourselves, especially the places that we have a sense of learned helplessness around, become the very things that we really expect from others. So, for example, if I make myself feel unimportant all the time, okay, and let's pretend that looks like I always deprioritize my needs. I always meet everybody else's needs, never show up for my own needs. I'm always like taking time for everybody but me. I diminish my feelings when I have them. I'm like, no one wants to hear about my feelings. It's fine. I'm not going to share them. I let go of my boundaries. I'm like, oh, my boundaries don't matter. I don't want to hurt or offend anyone, so I'll just let them go. Well, if I have that in the relationship to myself, because I have so much learned helplessness on solving those problems, if I'm still carrying them with me, then those become the biggest expectations I have in my relationship to others. So these become the very things where I'm like, Bob, when I get together with Bob, Bob better make me feel important. And when Bob doesn't make me feel important on Sunday morning or Tuesday evening or whatever it is, he forgets to do something or text me back or whatever it might be. These are the things that hurt so much. And they hurt because they're also our shadow. They hurt so much because we're running on empty in that needs tank in that area of our lives. And so we have this funny relationship to the places that we're disempowered in ourselves because we essentially use as a subconscious strategy to get that need met people outside of us. We're not doing it consciously, but it puts us in this place where this is where our expectations really come from. So whatever is essentially unmet in relationship to self and where we're disempowered and struggle, we then hope other people meet. And you see lots of different examples of this, right? It's like people who struggle to feel significant. It's like, oh, my relationship partner has to make me feel significant and wanted and approved of at all times. And sometimes I really expect that because I'm criticizing myself all day long or whatever it might be, right? So we tend to project these things onto other people to fix it for us. And we become very upset when they don't. And then they touch these old stories too, right? From childhood when we felt unimportant or like we didn't matter or whatever it might be. So it's really important when we're trying to go through like primary and secondary trigger patterns, we recognize that not only do we have these trigger patterns, but we usually carry these expectations with our partner. Okay. Like whatever we didn't fix and heal and solve from childhood, we have to fix and solve in our romantic relationships. And if not, that stuff's going to be there poking at us all the time. So it's a beautiful opportunity for growth for that reason. So how we actually do this, and I would love if you guys want to put some of your answers or ideas in the chat here, is number one, we want to identify the top wounds that come up for us in a relationship. Okay. So just like we were talking about with that woman, I am unseen, I'm unheard, I don't matter. And the man, it was, I am abandoned. And so they were interacting with each other in that form. So try to pick in your mind, either a past relationship that you were in, a really close family dynamic, because it applies there too. Perhaps a current romantic relationship, and try to look at like, what were the big core wounds where I had a wound and it affected the other person. Okay. I'll give another example of this just so you guys can feel comfortable. Another example could be, I will be abandoned, I will be trapped, right? Let's look at this one. The anxious, preoccupied, I'll be abandoned. And the person who's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be trapped in a relationship. I'm going to have to give up my sense of self. People expect codependency from me. And so you see this dynamic of the anxious, preoccupied person. When they feel abandoned, they come close. They're like, come closer. I need your attention. I need you. I need you. And the person feeling like, I'm losing my sense of self. I'm going to be swallowed whole by the relationship. And so those wounds interact with each other. Okay. So try to share in the chat. I'm going to give you guys a couple more examples, and then I'm going to read some out loud that you guys share. A really good one I see, FA dynamics and sometimes DA. FA thinks I'll be betrayed, right? Like I'm about to be betrayed. They're untrusting or suspicious at times. And they get angry when they feel this way a lot of the time, or emotionally volatile. And a lot of DAs feel really unsafe, right? When there's any emotional volatility. And that's a big core wound for DAs. And so you can have this cycle going around where the FA is like, I'll be betrayed. And the way they react to that wound is exactly what triggers the other person and their biggest core wound. Now, if you're really breaking it down, just so you're super clear, it's like you are wounded and you attempting to confront this wound through communication or whatever it might be, or the way you react when you feel this wound is exactly what triggers the other person's core wound. Okay. This is what our trigger patterns are. A last one is someone who's really afraid I'll be rejected. Right. And so they fear like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be rejected. They don't want to invest in a relationship because they're afraid that they'll be rejected. And so they pull back early, and that triggers the other person's core wound of I'm not good enough. Right. Or it could be somebody has a core wound, I am defective, or being vulnerable is unsafe, or I'm weak. And so I'm not going to invest. And then the other person's like, oh, see, I'm not good enough. That's what's happening here. And it's like we interpret through our own lens of these exact things, and it just goes around and around and around, but it's there to show us to ourselves. That's the purpose of it. Okay. So I'm just going to read any in the chat here. Oh, good. You guys do such a good job. I am unseen. I am unheard. I am helpless. Really, really good one. A really good one there. And I'll spell some of these out for you guys. If someone feels unseen, unheard, they try to talk a lot about something. This is like a huge one. I'm going to just tell you exactly how this works too. So someone in a relationship dynamic, and it can show up in two different forms that are popular, we'll say. One can be someone doesn't know how to resolve a conflict. They don't know how to communicate or how to like fix it. And they feel disempowered and then they shut down. And so someone will come and talk about a problem. The person just shuts down. And then it's like, I am unseen and I am unheard. And the other person is in a state of feeling helpless, right? Or another big one will be someone feels unseen and unheard. So they keep bringing up an old conflict because they actually haven't resolved it, because they haven't felt like their emotions were validated. And then the other person doesn't see that as a symptom of, hey, you don't feel resolved yet. So let me figure out, like, do you need more emotional validation? Do you need me to like meet a need or something? Like, what is not resolved? That's a symptom of something not being resolved. And the other person's like, I'm helpless. I don't know how to fix this or do anything about it. So such a good example. So those are some common ones. Unimportant, betrayed, not good enough, unheard, beautiful. And so you'll see there, right? It's like if someone feels unimportant and betrayed, then sometimes they'll bring things into a relationship like this. And they'll say like, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. And the other person on the other end, because, and this is again, like kind of goes hand in hand with the other one, but it's like, if someone doesn't have enough emotional literacy to know how to properly resolve a problem or a pattern, sometimes we'll see these dynamics where it's like someone's bringing something up and the other person's like, no matter what I try to do or say to fix it, it's just not good enough. And it's like, no, it's not that it's not good enough. It's that you're not doing the right thing yet. You haven't figured it out. The right thing the person needs to be properly resolved. And so we'll see a lot of these dynamics as well. These are great examples. I'll do one more in here. There's a lot of FA club people in here, I see. I'm too much and not enough, not worthy of love, unseen for who I am. I'm afraid to speak up for my needs because if I do, they might leave. Yeah. And so that's a really big one, right? It's like you can be in a position where you think, okay, I'll be too much if I speak up for my needs, and then I'll be abandoned. And then it just leaves somebody feeling like unseen. And from the other person's end, they may feel like, oh, there's just this big emotional disconnect here, right? There's this, like, I don't understand what's going on. And if we're not able to be vulnerable because we're afraid that, okay, if we're vulnerable, we'll seem weak or we'll push someone away, then we can feel I am disconnected as well on the other side. So really, really good examples, you guys. Thank you so much for sharing. And keep in mind, when we have these, we usually have two of them that are quite active at all times. We'll have like a primary and a secondary. So try to look, like, especially based on your attachment style, how does your major core wound, and I'm going to give you guys the actual steps right now. How does your major core wound affect their major core wounds? Okay. I'll give one more example. Let's say an FA feels like they're in a position where they feel unworthy. Okay. And so they overcompensate. This is another common one. So the FA feels unworthy, so they overcompensate. I'm trying to think of an FA one because I saw all these people be like FA club. And then you try to overcompensate. Then at some point in your own overcompensation, you feel taken advantage of, and then you feel angry. So then you criticize. And then let's say the other person's more avoidant on the other end, more DA, and they get criticized and they feel like, oh, I'm defective and I'm shameful. And they take that criticism so to heart, and then they pull back and retract. And then the person who feels unworthy is like, oh no, I hurt you. Now I have to overcompensate again. And it just creates this like spiral of resentment over time, right? So really, really important stuff. So if you want to go through steps, step one is identify the top wounds that come up for you in this relationship with whoever you're, a family member, a previous relationship. And this is how we actually do this stuff. Okay. Try to identify what you think their top 3 wounds are. Okay. What comes up for them. And then try to see how these things may be interacting. And it's a really good way of like pulling them up and really trying to understand what wounds of mine trigger the wounds of theirs, or what wounds of theirs are triggering the wounds of mine, right? We'll see another, I'll give one last example. It's just easier to explain through examples. A DA, they think if I'm weak, or vulnerable, or if I'm vulnerable, I'm weak or I'm unsafe. And so they just won't be vulnerable. And the other person's like, oh, they don't want to invest in me or invest in the relationship because I'm just not good enough, right? Or I'm just not lovable, or and so it's like the one person's core wound is exactly the thing that triggers the other person's biggest core wound. So we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at, now, what is a strategy for reprogramming on my side? Okay. So how can I take, and remember, this goes back to this idea that when we want to solve for problems in relationships, it's two parts. It's intrinsic first and communication second, extrinsic second. We have to do both. So we want to create a strategy to be accountable for reprogramming. And then we want to create a strategy in our next step for communicating, right? We want to be able to say, what's going on here? Let's talk about this stuff. In the communication pieces here, okay, and you guys can write this down if you'd like, or put this sort of out together. In the communication pieces, the first step when we're going to communicate externally. So after we've done the intrinsic work, I'm going to do the stuff to reprogram self. When we want to communicate externally, we need to first define what we need to fix the situation. So if you feel like you're not good enough, maybe you need reassurance. Maybe you need more words of affirmation in your relationship. If you feel unsafe, maybe you need for communication to be done in a more calm manner, right? If you feel like you're defective, maybe you need to have somebody explain where they're coming from and explain that their feelings are about them and their hurt, not about you, or something being flawed with you at your core, right? So you define what you need, and then you want to create a strategy in the relationship to say ahead of time, look, this is what comes up for me when this happens. This is what I need you to try to remember. And you want to take some accountability to create a strategy in the relationship to self on a more regular basis. So how can you show up for yourself to make sure you're working through these needs and meeting them yourself? And how can you make sure that you're communicating ahead of time? And then when things come up in the moment, you can say things that are easier. When we're heated, it's hard to explain all of it at once when you're in the moment. It's much easier when you try to explain something like, hey, and I'll use the example of that first one, that I am unheard, I am abandoned, right? The woman and the man. And all she had to do was say in the moment, first she sat down and we did this in a session, but ahead of time, I got her to over explain and be overly transparent and say, when I come to you with challenges that I want to talk about, it's because I love you and care for the situation so much, and I want us to be able to work through it. It's not because I'm trying to leave. It's the exact opposite. It's because I want to stay and I want to do the work to be able to make sure we keep growing together and don't grow apart. And so she said that. And then, it doesn't mean that the problem's solved. That's it. She had to do the work. He had to do the work on his wound, and they both had to understand that those wounds were coming up. And then she had to be able to say, hey, the way you're reacting right now, it's making me feel unseen again. This is really hard for me. Remember, I'm here because I want to work on things. I want us to keep growing, not because I'm trying to push you away. And that reminder in real time, when there was that anchored in reminder from the past, it's like, oh yeah, we're out of that space. And it's not going to work perfectly every time, but it's going to work a lot of the time. And over time, you actually get out of that primary or secondary trigger pattern because both of you have the awareness, both of you took the accountability in the relationship to self for the wound and understanding it. Both of you met some of those needs in the relationship to yourself that you were looking to be met. And then you've talked about it, you've communicated about it, and in real time, you have phrasing around it that allows you to more effectively move through it. And this is how we resolve these things. It's very, very important and very powerful work, because if we don't get out of these primary and secondary trigger patterns, we don't get out of the power struggle stage at all. So really, really important to be aware of. Okay. So the next major thing here that we're going to talk about, and if you want to go through in a little more detail and like start to finish in more of a long form, just because it's such an important topic. Again, step one, identify what you can about your primary trigger pattern, your wounds and theirs, identify where they coalesce, right? And then what you need for resolution. And when you want to communicate through it, you can say, like, let's say it is in real time, or let's say you want to talk about something that you know is going to trigger that person. You can preface communication by addressing what you need and debunking their core wound in advance. Okay. So let's say this woman, instead of it being during an argument, wants to do it going into a tough conversation. And she's like, I know that this tough conversation might trigger his big wound. She might start off the conversation by saying, hey, I want to chat with you about something. I just want to remind you too, like, that I'm not going anywhere, that I love you. I care about this relationship so much. And I want to talk about this because I want us to keep thriving together. And so we can always preface if we feel like we're in a conversation that could trigger someone's wound. It's a really good one for people who are struggling with criticism because they feel like I'm defective or I'm not good enough or I'm going to be abandoned if I'm criticized. Anybody who's personalizing it there. It's also great to say, hey, you are amazing in all these ways. I love that you do X, Y, Z. Come up with like sincere compliments, not things that you're just trying to say for the sake of it. And then say, and there's one thing I want us to be able to work on together. And it's that when this thing happens, it doesn't feel good for me, right? So you can always preface your communication by like debunking their core wound before you even dig into what the problem's going to be. It's a very like helpful, healthy safety tool. And then you can state your need in the situation specifically and even go back around again and just let the person know, hey, let's come up with collective strategies together to move through this. Okay. So there we have a really big part of repairing relationships. It's knowing, we've got our clarity first. We've defined like what we want, what we need to maybe introduce more into our current relationship or what we need to have for future relationships. And then we want to talk a lot about, okay, what are the current wounds that are affecting us? How do we identify those patterns? How do we move through them? How do we talk through them? And now I just want to talk for a moment here about de-escalating and asking the right questions. So when we're talking, because communication is huge for relationships, obviously. And like, again, one of the big themes was if we can't talk about stuff in a relationship, you're going to have a really hard time being in a healthy relationship, period. So with that being said, what do you do when someone else is triggered? Okay, we know how to de-escalate ourselves by now and what our core wounds are and what our needs are and how to identify our feelings. You're also going to see in next month's course a really great tool specifically for if you're really heated in real time and you're like at 9 out of 10 and you're like, I can't even like do the work around it right now because the emotion's so strong. So stay tuned for that. But if we are trying to actually de-escalate through a problem or challenge, we're going to do this in 2 parts. Okay. Tool number 1, people calm way down when you validate their emotions. We talk about that a lot in different places in here, but I'm going to give you some in-depth details. If you can say something like, I understand why you're hurt. I understand why you're XYZ emotion. So like what you want to be able to do is, let's say someone's really upset. Okay. Maybe they're angry. Maybe they're shut down. Maybe they are resentful or frustrated or sad. You want to be able to find what that emotion is that they're experiencing, which is usually pretty clear. Like if someone's waving their arms and raising their voice, they're mad. If someone's shut down and looks down and, they're probably sad or hurt, right? If somebody's withdrawing, they may feel uncomfortable or afraid, or disconnected or unsafe moving through a conversation. And so you want to be able to find that emotion and validate it. And you don't just say, hey, I see that you're hurt, right? You say, I understand why you would be hurt in this situation. Another really great thing is to say, and if I were you, I'd probably feel the same way. And it's not an admission of right or wrong. It's not like by you validating someone's emotions, they're in the right of the argument. That doesn't, and by the way, we're not really talking about right or wrong in arguments anyways. Most of the time that we're trying to, why arguments hurt us so much is because we're in a position where like, we really love someone, we really care for someone. And it's hard for us to wrap our head around how like they seem to not understand us. It's like, this is hurting me. Why can't you see and hear and understand me? And so we push to be right because it's just our subconscious strategy to push for some form of validation for like, oh, I see you. I see that you're in pain. We're just trying to like, if I'm right, then you'll finally understand me. You'll understand where I'm coming from. So we can get past all the right, wrong BS and we can just go straight to like the meat of why we're arguing and actually move through the argument that way instead. So the first part here is you want to be able to validate the person's emotions. Again, I understand why you're X, Y, Z. I might feel this way as well if I were you. And then you want to let the person know, step 2, what your intentions are. And you want those intentions, you think of like the intentions are like, and I come in peace, right? It's like, and I want to resolve this together. And I'm here to do that. I'm here to talk it out with you. I'm here to support you. So by first recognizing the specific emotion that they're experiencing, it takes us out of this, like, we're enemies. And part of like where this we're enemies thing comes from to begin with is because a lot of the time as children, when we were like all of our programming around arguments and fighting was big parent, small child, or big teacher, small child, and we would always lose, right? So a lot of our subconscious associations are like, someone comes and I get hurt and my needs are not met or not heard, and I lose the argument. And so a lot of us have conditioning historically that says like, I feel defenseless, I feel powerless, I feel helpless. And so we're often overcompensating in our adult lives by trying to equilibrate these old feelings from childhood, by taking our power back, by making our point known. And usually the more defenseless and helpless we felt as children, the more angry or volatile we may become as adults, as a strategy to get that power back again, right? To equilibrate from all of those times that we felt that way. And unfortunately, that's a really good example of how the subconscious mind tries to get its needs met in the fastest way possible, not the best way possible. Unfortunately, a lot of those things come with really strong downsides and really prevent us from actually solving problems in our adult lives. So we want to be able to say, I understand why you're hurt, or I understand why you're upset or angry. I would feel the same way, and I want to resolve this. I'm here to support you. Okay. This whole part 1 with these steps is all about like calming the situation, de-escalating. Okay. Then we're going to go into like the part 2, which is resolving. And then ask the person, okay, what do you need to feel better? We can say like, what do you need? What are your needs? All these different things. But unless you're dealing with someone who has like a little bit of emotional literacy, you'll usually get like a blank stare, right? It's like, what do I need? I need you to give me space, but that's like not actually the need, right? It's like the coping need, not the real need. So we want to say like, what would make you feel better? What would bring you relief right now? These sorts of questions. And then when the person tells you, your job is to confirm it. Okay. And to say, okay, so you are saying that you need reassurance right now, or I hear that you're needing XYZ. And it's just like this validation that I'm listening, I'm present with what you're saying. It takes us out of that like defensive, powerless, dynamic and puts us back on the same page. Now, part 2 is like, this isn't you. If you can really get that right, you're going to master a lot of arguments and conflicts. It's in the workplace, in your family relationships, in your romantic relationships. You can just like nail those 4 steps. You're going to like start feeling like, wow. And to be honest, like, this was stuff I would use in working with people, especially specifically with couples, when like one person would get super triggered. And I saw a lot of people get really triggered over the years, and like lots of things that you think wouldn't happen in an office setting. I saw most of them. And, like if you would I would do this with people and I would be like, hey, I see, like, and just very calmly, I see that you're really hurt right now. And I'd go through those steps, and it would be like, I like joke around about this, but it'd be like waving a magic wand a lot of the time, like just having someone. And I think it was beneficial for those people as well, or that person when it was happening, because if it was in front of the other partner, it was like that person heard too. Right. And that person had the understanding too. But if it's between 2 parties, it's even better, right? It's even more intimate. It's like the person that you love and really want to understand you understands you, not just the third party. Right. So really, really powerful. But then the catch 22 here is what we want to make sure we don't do is not take ourselves into consideration. So that's why that's like part 1, right? We've just de-escalated and now we've understood their need. And then you can strategize for it. You can say, yeah, I can meet this or not meet this, but you have to do it in a way that takes you into consideration. So now we have our part 2, and this starts with, Once the person has stated what they've needed, you have to actually think about your own needs. Okay. Let's say, for example, someone says, I need you to support me by helping out around the house. And okay, and let's say that's the argument. And the person's like, right now, I need you to do all the dishes and clean the upstairs and downstairs. But maybe you have like a back injury and you literally cannot like walk up and down the stairs right now. You're super injured, right? So these aren't always like someone asks for something and you're like, yes, I have to do it now that I've done those earlier steps. So what you want to do is step one, internally, think of like what's fair for you, what's reasonable for you, and take yourself into consideration. And then step two, state what you can do that's fair to you also, right? So you want to go in there and say, you know what? I would love to help you out around the house. Right now, obviously, my back is injured, but like, why don't we do this? As soon as my back is feeling better, I will take on these chores these days of the week, right? So you're deciding what's fair to you for your situation also, after taking yourself into consideration. And then what you can do is, because arguments have two parts, is then you can ask to share in return now that the person is regulated. So you can say, okay, are you feeling better? Do you feel understood? Okay, can I share a little bit about what I was feeling as well? And, we don't always want like that you have to be the person waving the magic wand and calming the person down and then sharing. Over time, as we introduce this type of communication into relationships, you want to say, hey, I want to start, right? Like once this is normalized and you talk this way, which usually happens quite quickly, because oftentimes, like, think of how desperately we want people to hear and feel and understand where we're coming from. And when someone validates, like, oh, you feel afraid, I understand that now. It's like, wow, like tremendous relief for people as experience. And so usually people like this stuff. Like once they get the hang of it a little, it's like, wow, it feels so good. It imprints us. It makes us motivated even at a subconscious level because of the amount of feeling that imprints the subconscious mind to want to have these types of conversations that move in a different direction. So once this person has said what they need, you take yourself into consideration, say what you can do, and then you say, can I now share? And you're going to share your experience and need, okay, what you're feeling and needing. So maybe you say, I interpreted when you were upset that I was unloved and I could just use some love right now. I could use a hug, whatever it might be, and then create a collective strategy to support each other in our needs. Okay. So it's like the brainstorming step. So what can we do to be better with your needs? What can we do to be better with whatever my needs are coming up in the conversation? And if we can start to practice kind of structuring our arguments like this, it's very hard to not resolve them. And it's very hard to hold on to resentment. I would say to so many people when I first met them, like in client sessions, I'd be like, the goal is to have no resentment in your relationships. And people would be like, that's not possible. Like, no, that's not possible. It is so possible. It's so easy once you actually just have the proper communication down, because you get to work through things. And what usually happens is, as a byproduct of working through a lot of these things, we feel closer to people because of it, right? We actually get into a position where it's like, hey, I actually feel even more close to this person because we keep working through things. I have more understanding of what goes on inside of you, and I have more understanding of what your needs are. And over time, when we talk about them more and more, we get good at meeting each other's needs. We get programmed to know each other's needs through repetition. We just know these are the things you need in an argument. These are the things that are important to you in your life. And we can validate and support each other in those a lot of the time. Okay. So now I want to go through 5 ways communication goes wrong. Okay. So things to be aware of that are pitfalls into this dynamic. And I'm going to add a bonus one at the end. Number 1, I can't communicate if I don't know why I'm upset in the first place. So sometimes we have to do this pre-work, right? Because sometimes we'll be like, oh, that's why it's really helpful to identify those primary and secondary trigger patterns. But I can't communicate if I don't know why I'm upset. So again, it goes back to that idea of like, I can say I'm angry about not doing the laundry. I'm so mad at you that you didn't do the laundry. We're not actually that mad about the laundry. If we're really, really mad, if mad about the laundry not being done and it being an inconvenience can only ever really be like a 3 out of 10. It's like an unmet need. If someone's reacting like an 8 or a 9 out of 10, it's always because there's some kind of deeper problem connected to it. So it's like, okay, we say we're angry about the laundry, but you're not that mad about that. It's about you feel unsupported and overwhelmed in your life, or because you feel disrespected that you asked me to do something and I didn't bother to meet the need, and you've made it mean I'm not cared about. You don't respect me. You don't care. You're not interested in supporting me. So we have to, whenever we're evaluating an upset, be like, what's the meaning I attached to why the situation didn't go the way I wanted it to? It's really important in communication. Like, that's always going to be a first step. Otherwise, we'll go back and forth about the dishes or the laundry or the gas in the car, or like all these surface things that don't actually ever enable us to solve the root problems. Number two, I expect you to mind read. You know, maybe I withdraw and I stonewall and I put my walls up, and I expect you to know why I'm upset, even though I haven't told it in words, right? And if we're doing that, huge barrier to solving for things. And just because you guys in here might all be really good at guessing what someone else is feeling, because a lot of you guys are probably quite emotionally literate and know all this stuff about human pattern behaviors, not everybody's going to be at the same level of emotional literacy, right? Like, so we have to be patient with people. And it's really important that we see our needs through. Sometimes you're going to have moments, and this is completely normal, where you're going to be like, but I said this need to this person like 5 times. How do they not remember it? And it's going to be really easy to make it mean they don't care. It's going to be really easy to tell that story. But if you really consciously look, well, did they try? Do they usually try after I talk about it? If your answer is yes, they try really hard after you talk about it and bring it up, they do care. They're just not good at remembering. They just don't get it yet. And sometimes we have to be a little patient with people to really allow. I just like look down at the screen. There's like Sherlock Holmes. Sorry. The costumes are really good, you guys. And Florence has got the little alien on here. Okay, sorry. It's really important, like, to practice seeing your needs through. Sometimes you have to communicate a need 10 times. The way to tell if someone's there for it or not is like, did they show up? And maybe it was messy. Maybe they showed up like 6 out of 10 times. And like the other 2 times they like kind of did it, but didn't really, or, people are never going to be perfect. This is a new thing for so many people in relationships. It just takes a little bit of time. So we have to be really careful. We don't expect mind reading. Even if you guys are good at mind reading, don't project from your perception and be like, oh, it's so easy to tell what their needs are. How can they not understand what mine are? That's a trap. Do not let your mind take you down that rabbit hole. Number 3, I don't actually want to be vulnerable and tell you my feelings and needs. Great way to really struggle with communicating. It's scary at first to say, I'm feeling this way and this is what I need, or this is my perspective. This is the wound that comes up for me and this is what I need. It's hard to ask for reassurance. It's hard to ask for words of affirmation. It's hard to ask for support, or to say, I'm overwhelmed. I really need like you to just do this thing around the house for a minute, please. Like, those are not easy asks. And, in fairness, like, these are things you're going to ask, like, in the power struggle stage of relationships. Ideally, you're talking about your needs and they're clear, like, all the way from the dating stage. You're not going to necessarily ask for reassurance from someone in the dating stage. You're not going to be like, hey, we've been on one date and I need reassurance. Then that's going to represent how disempowered we are in our needs within ourselves. But when you're in a committed relationship with someone where you're like putting in the work and you're investing the time and you're in that stage where you're like going to move to the next level or not, we have to open ourselves up. We have to do the work in this way. And vulnerability is not always the easiest, but it's extremely important. Once you're in a relationship dynamic where like you're spending lots of time together, you're investing in each other, like you've committed to being in that relationship, then it's time to have those conversations. Another great one, and I mentioned this a lot, but these are all the things you want to keep track of as it relates to communication, is I don't express clearly enough. This is one of my favorites. And what this means is I didn't paint the picture, as we know, of what the thing looked like. So I learned this the hard way in working with people. I'd be like, okay, guys, we're going to go this week. And, both of you said you need support this week. So we're going to be more supportive of each other, blah, blah, blah. Like, in summary of the session at the end, like the takeaways to work on for the week. And then, come back the next week and they come into the office and tell they're both a little like off or frustrated. And I'd be like, oh, how's it going? Like, what's going on? And one person would be like, well, my wife didn't really support me. She said she would, and I don't think she followed through on that commitment. And she'd be like, what do you mean? Like, I worked so hard to support you. And it would be something like, his support was acts of service. He wanted her to like take out the trash or like do the dishes. And her need for support was like words of affirmation or physical touch or whatever it might be. And so they were both supporting from like what would make them feel supported instead of what each other needs for support. And it's really important we check in with that, like with all our important relationships. Like, are we aware of that person's love language and how different it is from ours? And are we able to give to that person as they would need, not as we would need? And it's really important to talk about that stuff. And so when we're setting intentions to communicate through things and we're doing this heavy lifting and this hard work, we got to be really, really clear. We have to say, I need support and it looks like X, Y, Z, or I need more communication. And that looks like you doing this in this way, right? So the more clear and the more specific we are, the more pitfalls we avoid in advance. I don't see my needs through, really powerful one. If we're not seeing things through and repeating them, we may state it once. And I've seen a lot of this over the years. It's like, well, I communicated. I've seen this so many times. I communicated my need once to my husband 3 months ago, and he met it a couple times and then that was it. And it's like, yeah, but like, he knows you a certain way for so long. He didn't know you had that need for so long. So it's going to fall off. It just is. It's inevitable. So we are responsible when we have a need to remind people and to say, this is what's important to me. This is what I need. This is how I receive love. This is how I receive support. This is, these are what the things that matter to me in relationships. So we have to talk about that stuff. And then my favorite bonus one is that we do not do the work of being in a position where we express appreciation or acknowledgement when someone is trying. I've seen a lot of the like, I need support around the house, so I need you to fold the laundry. Maybe the wife asks the husband that, and then the husband folds the laundry and she's like, oh, why did you fold it like this? Like, it's folded all the wrong way. Do you know what the other person feels? They feel in that moment, I will never meet your need again. That's it. I will never do it again. I will not try. People, especially if that person leans more avoidant, because it usually takes a lot for the avoidant person to like even get comfortable with the idea that we can meet each other's needs. So if when someone is meeting the need, you turn around and criticize it in any way, you went backwards. Even though you got to that point, you then went backwards. So it's really important we acknowledge and we positively reinforce it. That's part of like programming. We have to be able to say, hey, thank you so much for folding the laundry, right? We can give feedback. We can say, thank you so much. This really meant a lot to me. I feel so relieved. I really appreciate this. Hey, next time, can we do this instead? Or sometimes I do it this way, just so you know, for future reference, but like, this really means a lot. So we can still share and give feedback. I see some of you guys asking what were the numbers. I'll tell you from top to bottom. First is I can't communicate if I don't know why I'm upset. So we have to give the meaning, understand the meaning we give to the things. We get to the root level of why we're upset. Number 2 is I expect you to mind read, right? So it's like, you better know why I'm upset. Number 3, I don't want to be vulnerable and share my actual feelings and needs. Okay. So we'll basically just get stuck at that point. Number 4, I don't express clearly enough. So I don't paint a picture what you do. Number 5, I don't see my needs through. I don't speak up about them regularly. Number 6, I don't appreciate after the fact. Okay. So I know that right now we only have so much time left and there's still so much more to cover. So what I'm just going to go through right now is I'm going to go through just some really important sort of seasoning pieces to give if you're in the power struggle of a relationship. So these are like the actual major, it's like the 6 major rites of passage you need in order to overcome the power struggle stage of a relationship. And what we're going to do with these things is we're going to look at these things as like seasoning. Okay. So if I'm in a power struggle with anyone, it can be a family member, a friendship. These are going to be the 6 major things that I have to get pretty good at if I want to evolve. Okay. So thing number 1 is acceptance. Part of like getting past things is learning to have some acceptance of where other people are coming from. Human beings are not here to be like a little machine to serve you. And I know that, no one feels like that in here, but sometimes we fall into a trap of being like, why doesn't he just do this thing? Like, why can't he just do this one simple thing? But sometimes like he's a human with a lot of things happening or a lot of things going on. And so we have to like just notice, I'm sure most of you guys in here, people who care about emotional connection and personal growth and relationships are probably like very generous, loving, giving people who are very supportive. Even the most supportive and loving of us, will still have moments where we're why did he have to do it like that? And it's like, okay, hold on a second here. Like, we're not here to nitpick someone's existence, right? So we have to come into a little bit of acceptance with things. Things are not always going to go our way. If it's meaningful enough to us, talk about it, deal with it. And if it's not meaningful to us enough, if it's like little things, be mindful about that. Be like, oh, here I am. I'm being a little nitpicky today. Like, I'm going to just make sure that, I'm not doing this. For me, yesterday, this happened. I was with my fiance and we were going to tennis and I was rushing because I had booked things too close together. And I had said, oh, I'm going to run in and get us a coffee. And he parked. And then I came out to like try to find him. And I was carrying these coffees and then carrying something else in my hand. And I remember being like, why wouldn't he park in front of the friggin' thing? Like, I've got coffees in my hand. Like, what? And then I'm like, and then I'm like, okay, no. I need everything to be perfect right now because I overbooked myself and I'm rushing. And like, he had to go park the car. And sometimes we need to have those little reminders because no one wants to be in a relationship with someone who comes in and is like, why didn't you park in the right place? Like, that's just nagging at that point, right? So we want to know that we're going to have these human moments and catch those things, right? Before we bring these things into relationships all the time. And part of that is like being able to like accept that like life and things are imperfect. People are imperfect. I am imperfect. All of us are going to have imperfections. And that's what makes living a little more fun and exciting most of the time. Number two, we have to get vulnerability right. This is like, it's hard and it's scary, but it's really courageous at the end of the day. I think it's really easy. I know I've had the core belief as a young adult at one point that, oh, like vulnerability is weak. Like that's, vulnerability is really strong. We are conditioned in the world we live in to like hide, right? To do everything to be protective of ourselves and to pull away. Vulnerability is courageous. It's hard to say what's really going on. It's scary to say what you're really feeling, but like we have to embody that strength and courage and do the work because that's what actually creates these massive breakthroughs in all of our relationships. And you guys have been really amazing. I've seen so many amazing shares from you guys in here about vulnerably communicating with parents or family members or, all sorts of different people in your lives, romantic relationships, and actually seeing these really powerful things come out of it. So you'll see more and more of that the more you do it. Number three, we have to practice empathizing and understanding. And what I really mean here, because some of us have this natural care for people, I mean like the difference between sympathy and empathy, right? The difference between, oh, this thing happened to you. And if that thing happened to me, I would need a hug. But maybe if that thing happened to you, you need space according to how you're programmed. So us just being able to really like not project from our perception, not assume that everyone would feel the same way we would in a situation, and to understand that, I have to look at that person as a human being and understand them and where they're coming from with their needs and their love languages and their programming, and be able to cater to that with someone I'm in a relationship with, not just assume. And, the really loving and sweet example that I find to be very endearing is I always think back to this, one young client that I was working with, and she was very anxiously attached, and her dismissive boyfriend were going through kind of like a hard time. And he said, I'm not breaking up with you. I just need space for the weekend. Like just not a good time. And then, the weekend came, and I think I had a session with her on like a Saturday. And she was like, I gave him space yesterday, but I know like, it's Saturday. And after a day, like I would really want someone to show up and do something. So, I'm just I baked him some food and I made him a letter, and I'm just going to go and drop it off. And it's like, hold on, that's what you would need. that's you. And it's like so well-intentioned, but it's like exactly what he said he didn't want. And as someone who's more avoidant, if someone says I need space, they probably do need the space. So, it's really important to be able to notice the difference between sympathy and empathy and understanding. Number 4, another important piece of seasoning. And again, try to check in with these 6 major things and just see like, where do I maybe struggle the most here? And what can I bring into the relationship more often? Number 4 is accountability. And us being able to own our stuff, us being able to say, oh yeah, I'm doing this thing and I should probably work on that. Or us being able to say, yeah, I did mess up in that argument. I did say that thing and it probably wasn't the right thing to say. Or I did mess up. I totally forgot about X, Y, Z. I totally forgot about our plans. I totally, and being able to just honor. A lot of trust is built through that, through us being able to just say, this is where I am, I'm willing to do something about it, but to admit and honor and be accountable. It's extremely important. And again, like some of these things we lose touch with when we have really hard and intense coping mechanisms, right? We kind of talked about this yesterday around shame. Like it's really easy when we feel so much shame to deflect or to be defensive, because it's like, what does shame make us want to do? Hide, avoid, deflect, defend, get away from. And so sometimes we have to work through our own feelings of shame to take accountability. Sometimes we have to work through our own feelings of fear to be vulnerable. But these are important practices that are necessary if we want thriving long-term relationships. Sometimes we have to work through our own prideful moments in order to be more accepting, or whatever it might be, right? Our own expectations of how things should be. So really, really important. Number 5, we want to become good at making effective compromises in relationships. And this really really means you taking yourself into consideration in a compromise. It's not just saying yes to everything, because you'll come to resent that person later. It's being able to actually take a look and say, this is where I'm at, this is where that person's at. And we're both willing to find a way to work through things together. And a lot of compromises are not exclusive compromises where things are like mutually exclusive. A lot of compromises are like additions, like we've talked about a lot. It's not like, oh, we need to spend more time together or less time together. It's one or the other. It can be things like, okay, let's spend more quality time together. And the need is really about the quality of time. So let's do things in that way. So there's a lot of like hacks we can come up with where it doesn't have to be like this or that. It can be like this and that in different forms. It was like Ala's example on Thursday evening, where he said, his girlfriend was doing the work and he was doing the work, and they were both really working, but then she had some jealousy around female friends. And it's like, well, before you just say, oh, it has to be female friends or not, how about it can be female friends that you keep, since they're your long-term friendships, or so it seemed. And when you're hanging out with female friends, you'll bring her along, you'll introduce her sometimes, you'll text her if she ever can't be there. You'll keep her included. You'll be transparent about how you spent the time. It's those sorts of like additions, so that it doesn't have to be one thing or the other. When we make compromises, we can compromise on like adding needs, not subtracting. And last but not least, how to own your part and apologize. Super important, not just like taking accountability, but learning to apologize when we've done wrong. In the actual how to repair your relationships course, there's a big section on that if you want to do a deeper dive, but we talked about a bunch of bonus stuff in here so far today. So time is up already. Time always flies in these things. Thank you guys so much for being here. I love that you guys dressed up for Halloween. That was like the best thing ever.